thought I might remind you that coincidentally today, being the 25th of February, is the 53rd anniversary, or the last real tram to run down Sydney streets south of Maroubra and La Perouse. Ran about 2 or 3 or 4 hours ago on the 25th, which was a warm, humid Saturday. The last tram left Hunter Street terminus on the Elizabeth Street run, having a year earlier been cut back from Circular Quay because of the construction of the Elizabeth Street extension. That's why you got that curved building from Hunter Street round to Elizabeth Street, which was in the old days occupied by Qantas and then TAA, I think. The last trams ran from there and also from Railway Square out to Maroubra and La Perouse to bring to a close the traditional tramway system that we had in Sydney. Very briefly, I'll just tell you a few interesting things about the trams in Sydney. After the horse tram, which only lasted a few years, we had the steam trams that started in conjunction with the international exhibition that was in the Botanical Gardens, just nearby, over the road. And that was in 1879. The line was constructed from the old Sydney railway station at Redfern along Elizabeth Street to provide reasonable transport from the railway terminus to the exhibition. It was found to be very successful, so the government decided to extend the tram lines, and the first line that was opened was to Randwick Racecourse. Sounds like even in those days the AJC and the racing fraternity had a bit of influence. But they also extended the line further down Oxford Street as well to Wallara, and then gradually it was extended out through to Bondi and down to Coogee. The extension beyond the racecourse was constructed, and also a tram line was opened from Newtown to Marrickville and subsequently linked up to the system in the city. As well, the line went out to Glebe, along Glebe Point Road. The steam trams really helped Sydney suburbia develop. Many of us would recognise that the older suburbs are bounded by, well, in the east, of course, right out to Bondi and Coogee. But in the western suburbs, as far as basically when you get to Burwood and Strathfield, you still have a lot of older houses, but they grouped around the railway stations. But further in, when you look at Leichhardt and that area and Petersham, the housing development sort of went along the tram lines. So really the urban sprawl, I suppose you would say, followed the tram line. That was basically in the 1880s and 1890s. Now we also had the cable trams. There were 2 cable tram lines in Sydney, one from the city along King Street, past St Mary's Cathedral through the area which became King's Cross and to Edgecliff, and the other one was from Milson's Point, the ferry wharf, up Alfred Street and Miller Street to North Sydney to Ridge Street, and later on extended out to Falcon Street. The reason for the cable tram lines was because of the hilly nature of Sydney. The steam trams weren't really suitable to provide the transport. The cable trams, of course, were pulled along by a continuous cable under the roadway. You had a slot in the middle of the road between the 2 rails, and this continuous rope was underneath, which was moved along through a winding machine in the winding house, one being located at Rushcutters Bay next to the depot, and the other one at North Sydney, corner of Ridge Street, next to the cable tram depot there. Now the one at Ridge Street still exists, the building at least. That's where the Independent Theatre is housed. So that's quite an interesting bit of history there. These days, as well as being used for various performances, it's also, I think, the training studios for the ensemble theatre. The cable trams, the ones that run in San Francisco, of course, operate on the same principle. You've got this continuous rope. And how the tram was pulled along, the driver in the front car, known as the grip car, has a couple of big levers. One is to latch onto the rope, and the other one, when he has to stop the tram, he lets the rope go and then pulls the other lever to put the brakes on. the average speed was 12 miles an hour, which basically you went from 0 to 12 pretty rapidly, because when you latched onto the rope, you'd be pulled along pretty fast. So you had to hang on. It was fast enough probably in those days. Although the steam trams, of course, had an express tram service that ran between Bondi and the city. In the morning peak and the evening peak, there'd be non-stop between the city and Bondi Junction. That's actually where the saying, shoot through like a Bondi tram, came from, because it was quite a fast tram service, certainly a lot faster than the cable trams. Now, in 1893, the first of the permanent electric tram services started. They were built as extensions of the cable tram service. First one from at North Sydney, out along Milperra Road to Mossman, and then the following one was from Edgecliff along New South Head Road through Double Bay to Rose Bay, and later on extended out to Watson's Bay. These proved very successful, so rapidly the authorities decided to extend electric tram services and replace the steam tram services and the cable trams with electrics. Now, the first main one was in the city, from Circular Quay in 1899 along George Street to the railway station at Devonshire Street, and then up Harris Street to Piermont. This became so popular that they started having tram traffic congestion. As a result, the tram lines were laid in Pitt Street and Castlereagh Street to take some of the pressure off the George Street services, because the steam trams were still running down Elizabeth Street, but they were then replaced by the electrics as well in the early 1900s. And then you also had the new railway station at Eddy Avenue being opened in 1906, and in conjunction with that there was the tram line built up onto the first floor level in line with the country platforms, well, all the platforms in those days. The suburbans, of course, moved along a bit further in later years. That would be probably the first example of a real transport interchange. I think it's probably still one of the best examples, certainly better than what we have to put up with at Bondi Junction, in my opinion, and also at Chatswood. But anyway, that's getting into the politics of things. The early electrics were the small four-wheel trams, the saloon trams, which were based on international design. You notice with the steam trams, they had the crossbench or footboard style, or toastrack as it became known, because they were very handy for moving the crowds quickly between point A and point B. With lots of doors, people could get on and off fairly quick, so the tram could then be on its way, carrying everybody to where they were going. So the early electric trams had their limitations. By the early 1900s, they started building the crossbench style of electric tram as well. The little four-wheel trams, the E-class, were two trams permanently coupled together. Now, these days they'd be known as an articulated tram. They were bendy trams, so maybe the idea is not so new after all. They were built partly because of the lines that they were being used on were fairly steep, running to and from some of the ferry wharves where the tram lines are being constructed. So they needed fairly powerful motors and a good heavy seating capacity to take the crowds that came off the ferries and such like. And of course, as you saw at Circular Quay, the hordes came off the ferries there to all hop on the trams. So they really were good at moving the crowds, the crossbench trams. Now, by just some interesting figures, 1891, there were 65 million passengers recorded travelling on the trams that year, and the population was only about 400,000. By the time it got to 1911, it was 218 million passengers, and the population was about 630,000. Now, as I mentioned, the tramcar design, you had the crossbench style, and of course, one of the popular things for a lot of passengers was to get on and off the wrong side of the tram and scale the tram by not paying their fare, which was a very Sydney and Newcastle characteristic. In the other states, they tended to stop people getting on and off the wrong side of the trams. It was officially, it was frowned upon, of course, but people did it. The other thing was the conductors, of course, worked on the footboards, had to collect the fares in all sorts of weather. Some of you possibly would remember the good old days sitting in the open compartment of a tram with the canvas blind down while it's raining outside and the conductor comes along wanting to collect the fares, and somebody might have their foot in the blind, keeping the blind down, and he'd be trying to pull the blind up while get all the fares. Meanwhile, people would be getting on and off the other side of the tram without paying. That was all part of the fun of travel on the trams in Sydney. The other thing, of course, was the paper boys who were able, unofficially, to sell their newspapers on the trams. It sometimes got a bit crowded, so sometimes, with the conductor trying to do his job as well, so the paper boys, some of them would operate on the wrong side of the tram, which was a bit hairy when you had the trams on the other track coming the other way. And there have been occasions where there were some accidents. Destination signs that the trams carried. The steam trams in the early days had coloured lights at night time on the front of the tram motor, which would identify where the tram was going. If you had a green light showing they were going either to Coogee or to the Newtown area, depending how many lights you had. And if you're going out to Bondi or the inner western suburbs, Glebe, Balmain and such like, you had red lights showing. So people got used to that idea. So when the electric started running, they incorporated the colours in the destination signs and created a whole lot of symbols. So you had 2 green dots for Newtown and became 3 green diamonds for Canterbury. And Balmain you had white and a red rectangle alongside each other. The Clovelly was most interesting. It had a combination of green and red. Now I think that was because one side of Clovelly Road was Bronte and Bondi and Tamarama. The other side of Clovelly Road, incidentally I live out that way, was the Randwick, Coogee area, which were green. And so the symbol for Clovelly was a green triangle and a red triangle side by side. Also there's a story that the Randwick Rugby Union Club chose the colour green. Now I don't know whether that was because the trams show that as part of their symbol or whether the tram chose the green from the Rugby Union Club. I don't know which came first, but some of you would probably be able to tell me about that. Just moving on quickly, there's some distinctive trams as well as the big toastrack trams. You had the smaller ones, which also got the nickname jumping jacks, because only having 4 wheels under the tram and the wheels being fairly close together to get round the sharp curves, they tended to jump and sway a fair bit, like a jack-in-the-box. So that's how they got the nickname jumping jacks. By the 1920s, in 1921, it was recorded that 320 million passengers were carried that year on the trams. The population was up around 900,000. Then 1929 we have the Depression, so things were pretty tough. A lot of people couldn't afford the fare, which basically was a penny. And by 1931 the number of passengers had dropped to 253 million. The population was 1,200,000. 1933, as you saw, we had the corridor trams, the new trams being introduced. And then we also had the trolley buses. The first trolley bus service was actually in the city from Town Hall up Park Street and William Street to King's Cross, and then along Darlinghurst Road into Macleay Street to Potts Point. That was in the early 30s. And then you had the longer service that ran from Rockdale and Cogra down Rocky Point Road to Sans Souci. 1939 we saw the Manly tram service closed, which was partly resulting from the costs involved in operating an isolated section of the tram service, which was based at Manly Wharf. And then we had the Second World War came along, so that stopped any further replacement of tram services, which the government of the day actually was already committed to implementing. By 1945, towards the end of the Second World War, 405 million passengers were recorded as travelling on the trams that year. The population was about 1.5 million. Of course, that was the era of petrol rationing, and things were pretty tough, so obviously it was a very high patronage. 1950s come along, of course, we have the coming of the Holden car and the massive expansion of motor vehicle manufacturing in Australia, all becoming a bit of history again now, unfortunately. So by the 1950s, the number of passengers was dropping substantially. 1951, 256 million passengers with a population of 1,800,000. The government then started re-implementing its tramway replacement policy, and after the closure of services to Ryde and some of the isolated tram services like the ones from Ashfield through Enfield to Mortlake and Cabarita, we had the major replacements of trams in 1957, the Pitt Street services to the Newtown area, followed in 1958 by the North Sydney and the George Street services, then 1959 the Sans Souci trolley buses, 1960 the Bondi Bronte trams were replaced, then the Watsons Bay line, the Coogee and Botany, and finally 53 years ago today the last trams to Maroubra and La Perouse. Now of course we have the light rail line that started in 1997. It's been extended from beyond Wentworth Park to Lilyfield and will be starting sometime. The date seems to be very fluid. I heard now it's April, it was going to be February, then March out to Dulwich Hill. And also, of course, we've got the proposals for the light rail to go down George Street, which I think will be great for Sydney, but I'll believe it when I see it. I don't want to sound like I'm a doubter, but having seen it all get closed and all that, and you know, it all takes a lot of money and a lot of effort these days, but I hope we'll see it going down to Circular Quay and out to Kingsford and Randwick. It certainly will do something for Sydney, but there'll be a lot of pain before it all happens because it's going to cause a lot of disruption to things. But yeah, I think it's worth it in the long run. A brief mention about the Tramway Museum. We've been going as an operating museum since 1965, originally in the Royal National Park, and then we relocated about a kilometre away right next to Loftus Railway Station where we are these days. A wholly voluntary organisation, which has its difficulties sometimes because we all think we know best when we want to see something happen. But it's been going quite a long while. It's certainly recognised as a major tourist attraction in the area in Sutherland Shire. The museum's got about 400 members. Active members are about 50, which is probably on a par with most voluntary organisations of that nature. We're very keen to sort of preserve our transport history, and we've been fortunate that we did receive some government funding over the years, particularly during the 1980s, late 70s and the 80s, initially from the state government, when heritage rated a little bit higher than it seems to these days. We were very fortunate to receive some funding to help get construction started at the new site from the government when Neville Wran was Premier, and I think he was Minister for Cultural Activities or whatever it was. Then the bicentennial in the 80s, we were fortunate to receive some commemorative funding to help get things moving a bit further, and since then we've received some other funding, but in recent years it's been small amounts just for restoration and only a dollar for dollar basis anyway, but we certainly got a long way to go before we've got everything finished. It's an ongoing thing. We hope one day to extend our tram line into Sutherland. We've been talking about it for the last 25 years. I know a few of the people in Sutherland Council have also been talking about it for that long, but it's a case of where there's some money coming from. But we hope that there will be some major tourism funding coming our way, although everybody else also is deserving. I think I'll leave it at that for the moment. If anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Can I ask, where were most of the trams built?
Most of them were built in Sydney. The bodies were constructed by some of the well-known companies such as, in the early days, Ritchie Brothers, then Clyde Engineering, Waddington's, which became Commonwealth Engineering, and also Meadowbank Manufacturing, or a major construction firm over there where the Meadowbank TAFE is now. They built quite a lot of them. The electrical equipment generally was imported, either from the US, mainly from the US, Westinghouse and General Electric were the main ones, and also some from Britain. In later years there was English Electric, but the workshops, the tramway workshops at Randwick were a massive setup there, and they could actually do a lot of the construction work, and they did a lot of rebuilding work there, and they were set up with quite a big facility there.
A couple of hands over that
Yeah.
side. Yes.
But 300 million journeys by a population of 1 million people is incredible.
Yeah.
So how does it all come to an end? Why did it
Well,
stop?
the politics and the vested interests. There was traffic congestion caused by what? They said the trams caused the traffic congestion, really, but what came first, the trams or the motor cars? But look, it was a fashion of the times anyway. In the 40s and 50s, in the English-speaking world, were replacing trams all over, in Britain and the US in particular, even before the Second World War. The Second World War sort of stopped that for a while, but then after the war they restarted. But then you have the contrast in Europe, where there was a lot of war damage. A lot of the cities just rebuilt their tram systems. But of course, the distance that people travelled in a lot of those European cities were shorter distances compared to here in Australia. But then by the same token, I mean, everything's relative, and politics does come into it too.
Peter, the extensive cut through the sandstone on the south, the headland south of Bronte Beach, roughly when was that put through?
Oh, that would have been early 1900s, when the Bronte line was constructed. Yeah, 1911, yeah. It's quite a job, that. Yes, there is still some under Oxford Street, and in fact where the mall is, the tram track was still under that until they reconstructed the mall a few years ago. Some of that track we assisted in retrieving it, and it was taken to the museum, and then unfortunately somebody took some of it. It made good scrap metal, because we didn't think anybody would take it. It was just lying alongside some of our track there out in the open, but somebody came along with a crane and just hoisted it.
Yeah. Back when the first stage was discussed with GHT, they were talking about running the old R-class on the new light rail, and the old R-class was 600 and the new
Yep.
one 750. Why didn't it happen? Why didn't they?
Look, well, the idea I think was it's a bit of a tourist thing. There'd be no problem to modify the trams to run on 750 volts, because actually before the light rail line opened the first stage out to Wentworth Park, the contractors hired a scrubber car from us, four-wheeler, 1899 model, and that was used to clean the tops of the rails. And one of our electrical engineers built a little bit of equipment there to upgrade the motors to take the 750 volts, so it was no problem.
That scrubber was used on the eastern suburbs rail.
Yeah, that's right. That was where it was first used. With the diesel generator at that time. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
What year was the Botany line electrified?
Botany,
Botany line.
early 1900s. Yeah, Vic's more the historian. 1902. Yeah.
The coloured destination indicators, the symbols,
Yep.
were they unique to the world, or were there other places?
No, actually Adelaide used them, and I think in New Zealand one of the line services in one of the cities there too. And you'd probably find it would have been other places too, I'd imagine. And incidentally, just a little sidelight, North and Western bus lines, the proprietor, Ken Butt at the time, he, being a bit of an enthusiast, he got some buses from Adelaide, second-hand ones, and their destination boxes were that wide, which was just wide enough for the tramway style destination roll. So he had included symbols above or below the actual destination of Ryde, Gladesville or Hunters Hill or whatever.